Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Jean Broyhill, and I'm the chair of the Arlington Committee of 100 Board of Directors. And welcome to our show tonight, our program tonight, Heat, Flood, and Storms. Oh my. If you're watching us on Facebook Live and you think this is something your friends would like, please consider sharing the Facebook Live to your page. A big thank you to board members Devanshi Patel and John Weistat, co-chairs of our program committee, for pulling this program together. And Karen Bate, Hannah Dannenfelser, and Dan Dixon for their communication and technical support for this program behind the scenes. Our last program for 2023 will be November 8th and will focus on upstream societal conditions and their intersection with the carceral system. You won't want to miss this. It's very timely. This will be a virtual only program as well. We will return in January with another stellar program to be announced soon. As we all know, it takes a village of great volunteers to put these programs together, and we need your continued financial support. To support us, just become a member of the Committee of 100 by making a financial donation to the organization during our current membership and fiscal year that ends June 30th, 2024. No donation is too large or too small. You can donate online using a credit card or by writing a check to the P.O. Box, also on our website. You can also volunteer with our organization. It's a great opportunity to get a wider view of our community and its issues. Visit our website for a form to volunteer under the tab Get Involved. And currently, we're looking for someone part-time who could manage some of our administrative and communication duties for our organization. You can use the same Get Involved tab to let us know your interests. When you submit a question for our panelists, which you can start doing anytime, please indicate whether you want it for a specific panelist or for the group as a whole, and state your name and keep the question in the form of a question, if you wouldn't mind. It makes it a lot easier for them to address those questions. We have a particularly stellar panel of experts tonight, and we may need to go into about a 10-minute of overtime Q&A time, particularly since we had to take up a little extra time at the beginning. I want to thank all of our panelists for their participation in this presentation tonight. They will be presenting in this order. Marianne Lavelle has covered politics for Inside Climate News for the past 6 years and covering environmental, science, law, and business in Washington, D.C. for leading publications such as National Geographic, U.S. News and World Report, among others. She has won numerous prestigious awards, including an award for a 1992 investigation, quote, on equal protection, unquote, on the disparity in environmental law enforcement against polluters in minority and white communities. Demetra McBride has developed and managed nationally and internationally recognized energy, sustainability, and climate programs for 18 years. She joined Arlington County in 2018 to lead its stormwater, energy, climate, and resiliency strategy and programming and implementation. Evan McWalters serves as legislative assistant for United States Senator Tim McCain. His core responsibilities include energy and the environment, agriculture and nutrition, tribal affairs, and transportation and infrastructure. Never a light load when you're a legislative assistant. Eleanor Hodges serves as executive director of Eco Action Arlington, a community nonprofit working to create a sustainable community by improving our natural environment, encouraging environmentally friendly behaviors, ensuring environmental justice, and addressing the climate crisis. So again, welcome panelists. We will plan on giving each speaker 8 minutes to make their opening remarks, as I said, in the order that they were introduced. I have a little bell here, his name is Fred, and I do ring it at the 8 minutes. And if you can quickly wrap up your remarks, that would be very helpful. We really want to make sure there's enough time for Q&A. So on that note, let's welcome Marianne Lavelle to give her presentation.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much. I am so happy to be sharing with, I'm glad to talk about climate change. Any time, but especially to talk to others in the community of Arlington, which I love and where I've lived for the last 23 years. Just to introduce myself, I work for Inside Climate News, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit news organization. We aren't supported by advertising or subscriptions. We are supported by donations from foundations and individuals, kind of like National Public Radio or PBS. And we cover all aspects of the climate crisis, including the impact on wildlife, the importance of religious leaders in pushing for climate action, and we write a lot about what state and local governments are doing, because that's where a lot of the leadership and innovation has been. My own job is writing about the politics of climate change, so I want to ask people to reflect on who do you think was the first president to mention climate change? I ask that because it's a question I was really surprised of the answer when I learned that it was Lyndon Johnson. And there he is in 1965 with his science advisor, Roger Revelle, who is one of the pioneers of climate science. And Johnson in 1965 message to Congress talked about the steady increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels. Now, scientists have never contradicted the science of Roger Revelle or that science. They have only built on it over the decades since then, including these guys who are the scientists, the in-house scientists at Exxon. And as you can tell from their hair, this was the late 1970s. And that's when their own research confirmed that fossil fuels had this role in driving global warming. This is one of their charts, and I know it's hard to read, but you've probably heard about people talking about the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and how important it was when we passed this threshold of 400 parts per million. The Exxon scientists figured that we would pass that threshold sometime between 2000 and 2020, and indeed we passed that in the year 2016. Here's an easier chart to read. This is NASA's chart, which you probably have seen on how temperatures have increased. It's been happening for quite some time. And unfortunately, we've spent a lot of those years not acting to do anything to address this. But what does this global warming look like, where we live? And here is a picture of a typical North Arlington neighborhood. It actually is my sidewalk and front yard. And this is what it looked like on July 8th, 2019. A lot of the Arlington residents on here, I'm sure I remember that day. That's when 3.4 inches of rain fell in 1 hour across the region. It was a daily record at National Airport. Thousands of homes and businesses flooded, including mine. There was a lot of damage, water rescues in Fairfax County, etc. This is another photo of that same street. Events like this are just right within what science has predicted for our region. In the late 1980s, Congress passed a law saying that federal scientists have to get together and regularly produce reports on what impact climate change is having and is likely to have in the US. And one of the things they showed very clearly is that the amount of precipitation following in very heavy events has increased 27% since 1958 in our region of the country. I'm just going to add one more flood photo. This is our neighbors to the south in eastern Kentucky. 44 people died in these floods in late July 2022. They had 14 to 16 inches of rain over 5 days. The impacts, I mentioned what happened in Kentucky because the impacts are not due to climate change alone, but to other changes we've made in our environment. And in Eastern Kentucky, it's the intensive coal mining and logging that has made led to erosion and made the impact of the heavy rains far worse than it would have been. And in our area in Arlington, the heavy rains react with our built environment, the impermeable surfaces, the buildings, the roads. And that's why we have the impact that we do when there's heavy rains. And state and local officials are really overwhelmed by this because they're bearing a lot of the brunt of the impact. Another way of looking at what's happening in our region is temperatures. Historically, we don't have a lot of nights where the low is above 75 degrees, but we're headed for a world where we have many, many more nights where the temperature just doesn't fall. And that has a whole number of effects. It really affects agriculture, for instance. Another thing it does is encourage the spread of vector-borne disease. It took scientists a while to really understand why the spread of the deer ticks, that's very clear across the US. These are deer ticks that cause Lyme disease. Scientists now know this also is tied to climate change because of the ticks' life cycle. And the warming we're seeing really gives them more time to reproduce. We have a reporter at Inside Climate News who just full-time covers health impacts of climate change. She focuses a lot on children because children are more vulnerable to many of the impacts of climate change, even the fact that they have higher respiration rates than adults makes them more vulnerable to poor air quality. You hear sometimes that climate science is uncertain, and in a sense that's true because scientists never predicted what we would have poor air quality in Arlington because of extreme wildfires in Canada. But that's exactly what happened to us this year. And so most of the uncertainty we have in climate science is because it's so difficult to predict how these impacts interact with each other and magnify each other. I'm going to end on a positive note, and that is in August 2022, Congress passed and President Biden signed the nation's first comprehensive climate law. I think Evan's probably going to talk more about this, but in any case, it was an unprecedented $370 billion investment in the clean energy transition, not through mandates, but all sorts of incentives for households, communities, states, and businesses to really reduce their energy use and their reliance on fossil fuels. For ordinary citizens, the Energy Star website is it's the government's Energy Star website, great resource for explaining a lot of the incentives available just to regular citizens to make upgrades to their homes, to install solar panels. You can even put in your zip code and you see not only the federal tax incentives, but rebates from utilities like Dominion Energy. One of the things since I began covering climate change, back in the early 2000s, that really has been a positive thing is the cost of renewable energy has plummeted, so it's really competitive, certainly competitive with other forms of energy and far outstrips coal. And what we can see, I like this chart because it shows that even 2023, much better than 2022 in the number of days when renewable energy is just beating out coal on our whole country's electric grid. The renewable energy is on track to double its share in just 1 decade in our country, and even take some share away from natural gas, which is right now our #1 source of electricity. We're not anywhere where we need to be, which is net zero emissions by 2050. However, we're really, for the first time ever, we can say we've made a start in tackling climate change. And I think the fact that you're participating in this session shows that you're interested in being part of that. So I'll be glad to hear what others have to say and your questions.
Thank you so much, Marianne. We now move to Demetra McBride.
Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. Thank you, Marianne, that was so great. And I'm so happy to see the things that you covered, because you went on a global and you brought it down to the local scale. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit more about what Arlington County has done, what it's doing, and what it will be doing. Okay, and suddenly for some reason, oh, there it goes. Okay. So there's a lot that's going on in Arlington. It's extraordinary, and it would take an entire day to really go through everything, not detailed, but big. So I'm going to actually tell you a story tonight. You're going to get copies of all of these presentations. Certainly reach out to us with any questions that you may have. But I just want to set a stage. Back in 1979, actually very consistent with what Marianne was talking about with President Johnson, the leaders of insurance and reinsurance companies around the world, including Swiss Re, first admitted publicly that they considered climate change in 1979 one of the biggest threats and one of the largest problems they would encounter in the insurance and reinsurance industry. In March of this year, there were several companies that came forth that are impacted or definitely very deeply related in the climate challenge, and that included insurance and reinsurance companies. And they told a committee led by Senator Whitehouse that it used to be their business was really looking historically, and governments did this as well. You said, okay, well, let's look at what happened in heat, or let's look at what happened in flooding over the past decade or the past 20 years. And then let's start planning based on that historical trend and where we are today. And now what you really have to start doing, and this has been growing for quite some time now, is that they've told the Senate committee, now we have to start looking forward. It's no longer an issue of just looking back. And that really fits in with this three-legged map of how you have an enduring, sustainable community. And that's the story of kind of where you want to be, and everybody picks this, arbitrary mid-century date of 2050. So typically governments say we want to retain a competitive, thriving, performance-based magnet community that has a highly desirable and quality of life that has this ability to endure. I've been working in climate for 18 years. I was very, very fortunate to be at a particular position that was really right at the inception of the launch of people really starting to look not just at climate mitigation, and this is this three-legged map. Mitigation is just looking and saying, okay, what can we do to reduce current greenhouse gas emissions so we can arrest this acceleration and escalation of climate impacts? And then you also have to look forward and say, well, what about climate adaptation? What about the impacts that we know we cannot avoid? Because don't forget that carbon has an atmospheric life of around 120 years. So you're not just dealing with the emissions that are being produced today. You're dealing with this compound interest in accumulation of carbon emissions, some of which may have originated in the Industrial Revolution. And then this climate resilience, which is really how do we future manage? How do we succeed despite these trends and impacts? And Arlington County really made a strong pivot in its community energy plan, which is its climate action plan. in 2019 to say, no, we're not just going to focus on mitigation. We're going to take into account all three legs of this map. Not surprisingly, and as Marianne showed you, and I'll give you some dramatic photographs too. This is Lower 4 Mile Run, and this bank, usually the water is around 15 to 17 feet below the bank, but it topped out. This is Columbia Pike in the business district, and this is at a neighborhood that I won't name or identify, but it was not an unusual neighborhood on July 8th of 2019. And what you had again at that Columbia Pike, that 15 to 70 feet to overtop the bank, that occurred in 45 minutes. So we're really talking about not just waves of water and heat, but we're talking about intensity. The intensity that you see in Arlington is that these very short cloudburst storms of high intensity, high volumes of water coming down, they quickly overwhelm the system, and then you have this mass flooding. And then, of course, you have the same with heat. It was Phoenix, and I believe it was almost consecutive this past year at 51 days of heat in excess of 110 degrees. These, and you'll see me kind of referring to costs, because when you start talking about what are the strategies that hit not just mitigation, but adaptation and resilience, that really is the science of risk mitigation. And risk is really a social and economic and an environmental calculation. So currently right now, flooding is, for the past 10 years, the one climate extreme event, weather extreme event, that is causing the most losses and repetitive losses. So it averages around a little over $34 billion a year. That is fully expected to increase by 2050, 26 to 28%, not to be outdone by extreme heat. And the Rockefeller Foundation estimated, and this is simply in productivity losses. This is just losses in the workplace and in business activity. That can even include things such as increased costs of workers' compensation and insurance, but it's $100 billion a year. And that does not include the extreme and really profound costs of energy and public health associated with extreme heat. So then you have these kind of, I call them silent, but these profound impacts. And a lot of these, you'll hear us use the term commonly, and it's the cascading impacts. So you may not have a business or a home that was flooded like you saw with Marianne and the short film I just showed you. You may not have lost a car as it got subsumed in water and just washed down the street. Or when you were trying to get to work in Washington, you just ran into an unseen dip in the road where you literally were on the top of your car, and those were those water rescues that Marianne referred to. But that does not mean that you are not profoundly impacted by climate change. And again, because there are these environmental degradations, there's these social degradations, and there is these extraordinary costs and the impacts that affect all of us as a community. So some of these special costs and loss and impacts, definitely public health and safety. And Marianne mentioned children, and children in particular, because their respiratory systems are developing till the time they're around 11, 12 years old. So everybody thinks when we talk about vulnerability groups, oh, that's low income people, and that is a large group, admittedly. But it also includes children, it also includes seniors, it also includes people with chronic illnesses, it includes people who have immuno deficiency and immuno syndromes. It affects pregnant women. And it affects public health in a way, particularly extreme heat. We talked about 51 days, more than 110 degrees. The human systems, the kidneys, the liver, they start breaking down after 4 consecutive days outdoors, and that level of actually, even lower. I think it's 105 degrees. So you start talking about increased emergency room visits, hospital visits. You talk about increased rates of stroke and heart attack. You talk about avoidable deaths, and you talk about really this kind of assault on just the public health and safety at large. You have government operations, and don't minimize this, because flooding will destroy other infrastructure, roads, It will back up sewers, so you'll have sewer discharges of a large degree into this kind of wall of water that's traveling. So it's taking sewage and non-point source pollution and garbage throughout the entire community. But when you talk about extreme heat, you're talking about very significant degradation and accelerated degradation of concrete, so your sidewalks, of roads, and of anything with metal, so bridges and all that, because the metal tends to constrict and it loses its elasticity. So you have high acute increased costs of government operations and maintenance that takes away funding from other critical services and operations. Don't forget, sorry?
You wrap up your remarks now? I don't think my bell's being heard.
Am I at 8 minutes? Okay. So again, going to insurability, bankability, and markability. I am not going to read this. I do want to point out the CEP roadmap. We have the CEP, the Community Energy Plan. That is the conceptual or policy overview. But the roadmap, look at that, because that is operationalized. It gives exact measures, exact dates, exact targets. It's measurable, it's accountable, it's reportable. And here we have these 5 buckets of strategic planning, implementation frameworks, execution, and funding mechanisms. I have to show that we just a week and a half ago received a LEED Platinum City certification for the 2nd time. 6 years ago, we were one of the pilot cities, but in the 6 years, the rigor and the level of achievement geometrically increased. So we're very happy to be one of only 7% of the cities that are Platinum certified. And then again, this future vision. So this is soon to come, but I do want to go down to the bottom. The government represents 4%, and that includes schools and all their fleets. So the bus fleet, transit, and the school bus fleet, as well as buildings and operations, represent only 4% of your greenhouse gas inventory. Private sector and our personal choices and how we travel, live, consume, for example, all of those make up the other 96%. So really that success, that sustainable community that we talked about, that is the story that is best and is most successful when we tell it together, and we look forward to doing that. So I will stop right here and I will turn it over and look forward to your questions, and thank you for having interest in this subject.
Thank you, Demetra. Evan, it's your turn to talk from the legislative perspective.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for having me here today. Again, my name's Evan McWalters, and I staff U.S. Senator Tim Kaine in his D.C. office on issues like energy, environment, agriculture, and infrastructure. I'm going to give you all a crash course on kind of, some of the things Congress has done on climate. Traditionally, it's been too little, and a lot of it has been focused on the adaptation side and responding to disasters, and not as much on the mitigation side. But most of what I'm going to cover is since the pandemic, and I think a lot of you all will. A lot of you may know a lot of this already, but you'll also be impressed with just how much has happened in the past couple of years, while recognizing there's still more to do. Senator Kaine serves on the Armed Services, Foreign Relations, Health, Education, Labor, Pensions, and Budget committees, which traditionally don't focus a ton on climate change. But as Demetra pointed out, that committee that Sheldon Whitehouse chairs is the Budget Committee, and we've been covering a lot more on climate, which is exciting, trying to raise the profile of these issues to the public. The first piece of legislation I want to talk about is the bipartisan infrastructure law that passed in 2021. There's actually a lot of good climate benefits packed into the bill. First and foremost, Virginia is going to get $1.2 billion from public transportation. A lot of that is already coming in. We've seen places like Alexandria electrify their fleet as a result of some of this funding. WMATA gets a huge chunk of change to just ensure that our transit systems are up and running to keep cars off the road. Speaking of those cars, $106 million over 5 years will go to EV charging infrastructure throughout Virginia. There's going to be a lot of challenges when it comes to energy storage and grid modernization and sourcing of critical minerals when it comes to building out that infrastructure. So that's a challenge on the horizon, but the funding is in there to at least get this off the ground and start building that network that people need in order to make electric cars viable on a daily basis. Passenger rail is another program that will benefit tremendously from this bill, including Virginia's Transforming Rail in Virginia initiative, which will double rail capacity throughout the Commonwealth. In particular, the Long Bridge project is one that Senator Kaine has championed that will open up the bottleneck of the rusty CSX bridge that goes from DC to Arlington. We've received $20 million for a ped bike portion of that construction project. We're still seeking hundreds of millions of dollars in additional federal funds for that, but we're hoping for good news soon. And in line with that good news, we just announced $100 million a week or so ago for the Franconia Springfield bypass, which will not only benefit passenger rail, but also ensure that freight rail is moving effectively, and a well-oiled supply chain will help reduce emissions as opposed to resulting in backups and fossil fuels being burned from that. Probably our biggest project when it comes to climate resilience that Senator Kaine is focused on is the $400 million coastal storm risk management project that we have in the Hampton Roads area, particularly in Norfolk. That is a partnership with the city of Norfolk and the Army Corps that we have to advocate for federal funds for, that includes seawalls, pump stations, green and gray infrastructure to prevent the worst impacts of worsening storms on that coastal community and building it for a resilient future from sea level rise and other impacts that will cause much of the city to go underwater or flood to the point where it's inhabitable and uninhabitable in some places. And that is sort of a cutting edge project that we'll probably see other cities take on as sea levels rise, as weather worsens. It will cost many billions of dollars, but it is an unfortunate necessity with the fact that we've already gone over climate change impacts are at our doorstep. That port infrastructure and Army Corps infrastructure funding that was in the infrastructure bill also supported a staging area at the Port of Virginia for offshore wind build out as part of the larger coastal Virginia offshore wind project. So it positions Virginia as an offshore wind manufacturing and export hub. So our state will play a critical role in a clean energy future through that project. Real quick, actually, as a side note, I meant to mention at the beginning that in case there's any members of the press here, I have to say that everything I'm saying is off the record, and also that what I convey tonight in the Q&A or otherwise may or may not be Senator Kaine's position, but I will try to stick to his views as closely as possible. Other great things in the infrastructure bill: money for Clean Water State Revolving Fund to ensure clean and healthy drinking water, but also to protect against some of those flooding impacts and combined sewer overflows that we just saw pictures of on Demetra's slide. $238 million for the Chesapeake Bay program that the EPA runs to ensure best practices, whether it's in the transportation sector, in the agriculture sector, or otherwise, to ensure a healthier and cleaner Chesapeake Bay. There's other great projects like the first ever DOT climate resilience program to ensure that highways and other transportation infrastructure are built with climate resilience in mind. There's funding for wildlife crossings, clean school buses that many Virginia school districts have already taken advantage of and landed funding for. There's money to build clean energy projects on abandoned mine lands. And so far, we've already seen $6.4 billion come to Virginia, with more to come as that bill is funded over 5 years for most things. This is way too much text that I will not cover completely, but the other huge piece of legislation, of course, is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the biggest action the United States has ever taken on climate change. And I've also heard people say it's the biggest action in the history of the world to help with climate change. So extremely significant, and passed the Senate by only one vote, which we'll get to my last point here as I conclude. But we have clean energy tax credits for not only manufacturing, solar panels and offshore wind turbines and things of that nature, but also to incentivize utility companies to produce that clean energy over time. And that's all done with these different formulas where we were plugging in policies as we were drafting the legislation to make sure that each policy stayed aligned with a certain emissions reduction goal. And that based off of, getting all 50 Democratic senators on board with the legislation resulted in a figure that was a 40% emissions reduction by 2030. And so we'll see about $11.6 billion, potentially more, to Virginia for clean energy generation. There's also tons of funding to help farmers with best practices and foresters with best practices, as the landscapes involved in those industries can play a huge role in sequestering carbon. There's rebates, as we discussed before, for people to retrofit their homes with more environmentally friendly technologies. There's also the electric vehicle tax credit that's been covered a lot in the news to incentivize more individuals to have those in their driveways. And I've put a link at the bottom for folks to check out how to capitalize on some of these rebates and tax credits. This is the Virginia specific website here. And of course, my email was in the first slide. If there's ever any additional questions on all of this, I'm happy to answer it. So a few other climate policies that Senator Kane's working on in the background. Yeah,
Comments up.
absolutely. So NDAA is a way that we can do climate resilience on military installations. We've done earmarks or congressionally directed spending to build trails and rebuild homes that have been destroyed by flooding in Southwest Virginia. We've supported tribal recognition in Virginia, which allows for Indigenous knowledge to be incorporated into infrastructure decisions. Money is going to acquire more lands, which is through the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is another way to sequester carbon and also ensure public recreational access. And we'll be pushing for that. Again, in the Farm Bill, we have two pieces of legislation that would conserve about 100,000 acres in the George Washington National Forest. We have climate goals in mind for that. And we also need the workforce to manufacture and build all of this clean energy technology. And Senator Kane is pushing for additional legislative action to ensure we have people to fill those jobs. I was asked to cover a little bit how advocacy helps in this whole picture. And I will say we're always taking meetings, phone calls, and emails to our office, but also a recommendation would be to find an organization that aligns with your goals in this space, whether it's helping endangered species or planting trees or planting oysters in the Chesapeake Bay. You'll find that any of these groups that you volunteer for do funnel into your elected officials through an advocacy arm of that group. So that's another great way to get involved, and all of those advocacy groups do drive the legislation that we end up writing and passing. Thanks for your time, and I'll pass it over.
Thank you so much, Evan. And now we move to Eleanor Hodges.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Evan, if you can take down your slides, that'll help me share mine. I am with Eco Action Arlington. We are a 45-year-old community nonprofit, and it's a pleasure to be here, as well as to be with our partners. Demetra McBride is the principal partner through Arlington County Department of Environmental Services that manages our relationship. Eco Action Arlington is working on the things that we're talking about here tonight, how we can all personally address the climate crisis. And our ultimate vision is that everyone who works, lives, and plays in Arlington is collectively engaged in creating a sustainable community. So tonight's topic is perfectly aligned with the work that we do every day. A little bit about how we do our work in the community. We really are about enabling individuals to take part in these actions, connecting them with experts. We have amazing expertise in this community. So finding the businesses and other experts who have pathways to taking sustainable behaviors in your home and in your household. We work a lot on protecting our natural resources. Engaging youth is very important. I think that was addressed a little bit tonight about the impacts on youth, but as well as the fact that youth are inheriting the decisions that we're making. So that's an important part of our work. And we also advocate strongly for holistic solutions. So we really are looking for those solutions that we can be yes and, so that we're not trying to find the environmental solutions, but trying to find the community solutions that will do all the things we need to do for healthy, safe, and adaptable communities for our future. So to answer the question about what we can do, I chose to provide 3 different answers. And really it's about finding what connects to you, and everybody's at a different place in their journey. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about, no matter where you are in the journey, it's important to think about what you can do right now. Think about what you can do to engage broader circles. So through schools, through your workplace, through your places of worship, finding other people that can come together to take these actions. And then once you're at the further along place in the journey, I really do echo that activity to advocate, because making sure our elected officials are hearing about the importance of climate action is important as well. So quickly, this is the data from the Union of Concerned Scientists that show you where your personal emissions are coming from. And this really does point to the biggest sources in our home. So the home heating and cooling and other home energy adds up to about 1/3 of our personal carbon emissions. Other big chunks come from transportation, the stuff we buy, and our food. So based on that, we have 5 low-hanging fruits. And one of the things we like to talk about is that oftentimes people are making decisions not necessarily just thinking about climate and reducing climate emissions, but what's in it for me? So looking at things that help people save money, help make their homes more beautiful, all those things really do help when kind of making these starting points. So a lot of these low-hanging fruit solutions really do also bring in the saving your pocketbook. When you remove English ivy from trees, you're also making sure that you don't promote habitat for mosquitoes, because mosquitoes love English ivy. So by removing the English ivy, protecting trees, which are amazing resources to collect that carbon from our atmosphere, you're also making your yard a more pleasant place to be. And then solutions like not wasting food. So when we think about what we're preparing, just individually in our own homes, we can reduce food waste, save money, and also think about the fact that the more that we can reduce that food that we're doing, we're providing food for people who need it more. The last thing in this low-hanging fruit that I wanted to talk about was the fact that in order to protect our environment, I do think it's really important to connect with nature. Richard Louv coined the term nature deficit disorder in 2005. And I do think as we're looking at all these things that we need to do to adapt and mitigate and address the climate crisis, it really is important to just stop and make sure that we're getting outside, connecting in the forest and the streams and the beautiful, wonderful nature that we have in Virginia and in the Arlington environment. So the next bucket of solutions I wanted to talk about comes from the resource Project Drawdown, which was created by a number of researchers working with Paul Hawken. And this is about solutions that have been vetted because they have been shown that they are currently available, growing in scale, financially viable, and they're able to reduce greenhouse gas concentrations in Earth's atmosphere. So while these table of solutions that were developed are really looking at systemic solutions that would be approached by corporations, countries, governments, it is interesting to also look at these from the point of view of what we can do. So I picked 5 from the Project Drawdown solution list that can then be applied to our own personal lives and showed the ranking of where these solutions fall in the Project Drawdown solution table of solutions. So the ranking is by how much carbon they will ultimately end up in reducing. So it is kind of interesting to see that simple things that we can do, like the food waste that I already mentioned, eating more plants and less meat do fall at number 1 and number 2. So other solutions that we can tank that I think have all been mentioned here tonight are the solar panels, which is number 10, planting trees, which is number 15, and making your home more energy efficient through insulation, which is number 18. 2 quick resources for people that are looking for either for solar, I'll start with, is the Virginia Capital Area Solar Switch. Arlington County has a partnership with Solar United Neighbors of Virginia, and this is a great opportunity to go solar in your own home through a solar co-op. And there's information on both the Eco Action Arlington and Arlington County website about this resource. And then for those interested in trees, Arlington County has a tree planting program that's free to anyone with private property in the county. And information for this program is available on our website, and there's 2 opportunities a year to get free trees on private property. Lastly, I wanted to kind of bring up what was just mentioned from Senator Kane's office about the advantages of the current Inflation Reduction Act, and really talk about what's kind of becoming the next big milestone in what we can do in our homes, which is about electrification. So we really do encourage people, especially if you've already done things like an energy audit and done the Energy Star appliances and done LED lighting. If you're ready for these electrification steps, there's going to be incentives available, and it will be looking at everything in your home, switching it where you can to gas. So looking at conduction heating, conduction cooking, replacing water heating, clothes drying, and space heating systems from gas and going electric, and then the electric vehicle that was already mentioned tonight. And then also, again, kind of going back to that advocacy, we do really need all the elected officials to hear more about that. We want to switch our public transportation and school transportation systems to electric. So I've pulled a free resources for everybody. Some of these were already mentioned. A couple I wanted to highlight is Rewiring America has amazing information about electrification. And then for anyone that is connected with the school system, we really do recommend the World Wildlife Fund Food Waste Warriors program, which really talks about food waste at a kid level, and also about looking at how schools can be champions for reducing food waste in schools. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to the question and answer.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. These were great presentations. I think probably the best way that we have a slew of questions, and they're all good. So I think probably the best way to proceed is if you would like to answer the question, just raise your hand, and then we'll just kind of go first come, first serve as far as who goes with the question. The first one is from Jane Zimmerman, and she asks, how will upzoning, bonus density, and constant changes to the GLUP be reflected in the county's adaptation and mitigation plans? Demetra?
Wow, I guess that we're going to go to me because I am with the county, but unfortunately I am not with the Department of CPHD. I will tell you one thing. There is a lot of activity. There was a presentation yesterday before the board. If you didn't see it, I would encourage you to go to the work session from yesterday that dealt with the commercial market resiliency initiative, because as you know, we, along with other cities all across the United States, have suffered a downturn in the office occupancy rates. So that also included a supplemental presentation on the GLUP. I know that CPHD and AIR and OSM, my bureau, have been working increasingly on a multi-level basis over the past, I would say, 3 to 4 years. Because land use planning, we often forget that that is really a core piece of climate action and sustainability success. So the land use planning is very critical. So it's a very complicated question you raised. It has a very lengthy answer. I would encourage you to look at that tape, and please reach out to us another time, but know that we are working very closely.
Thank you, Demetra. Monica Hirschberg asks, how can Arlington Public Schools work with the county to achieve sustainability? And I'm going to add another one to that because it's about the schools. This is from Eleanor Dasenbrook. Are solar panels considered a requirement in new county school construction? Is anyone in a position? Demetra, do you want to answer that again?
I know that, and particularly when you look at schools, I'm going to brag a little bit about the schools, and they do it on their own. They are very, very committed to LEED Platinum and LEED Gold standards on new design and construction of schools. And if you look at the Discovery Elementary School, that was really land breaking, on a national scale. So I know that they themselves hold themselves to a standard of renewable energy, geothermal energy, energy efficiency. We are working with them on the bus fleet. So they do have just a culture for new construction. Obviously, it's a little bit of a different question when you're talking about existing buildings.
John Quinn asks, is Arlington working effectively with its neighbors, DC and Maryland? And I would also raise, are you working across other areas within the Northern Virginia area on mitigation efforts?
Gosh, I feel like I want someone to have a question. We have such a great panel here. I'm hoping they get the opportunity. I'll be very quick. Yes, the answer is yes. We work very, very closely with our regional partners under the Northern Virginia Regional Commission and with the Metro Washington COG, Council of Governments. We work on a multi-state basis. So we work with DC, jurisdictions in Maryland, and also in Virginia. And in fact, we're collaborating a lot under a lot of the federal grant opportunities that Evan went through.
Well, I think this is a good one for a lot of the other one of you panelists to answer. Joyce and Roy Gamzee ask, how do the many wars raging around the world affect climate change?
Question.
Marianne?
I'm not going to be able to definitively answer that, but I'll tell you that this is really a subject of a lot of study. The carbon footprint of, for example, what's the war in Iraq. And of course, the answer is it's not good. It's not good. But I will say that NATO has been really focusing on what the militaries can do to really make their operations less dependent on fossil fuels. And one of the reasons is, and I'm sure Evan can talk about this because of Senator Kane's involvement on the Armed Services Committee, one of the real risks to soldiers is having to supply troops constantly with oil and jet fuel, and really that has been a huge risk to our soldiers in many parts of the world. And that is one of the reasons that the military, actually the US military, huge energy user, also has been kind of at the forefront of things like installing solar panels and studying and deploying renewable energy solutions.
I'll just quickly add, to that last point. Obviously, the Department of Defense gets a lot of funding, so there is a lot of cutting edge technology that is achieved through the Department of Defense. So, we may see some advances in clean energy technology through them, but climate change is another kind of enemy to confront for military installations. We've only recently begun passing legislation that requires the DoD to really take an active look at their military installations against things like sea level rise and extreme weather. And we're going to have to look at potentially doing the same thing for our allies and strategic military bases around the world. And that doesn't even get to, the carbon implications of conflict, which are not good, obviously. But at the same time, I am encouraged by following and attending things like the UN conference on climate change, the COP every year. I would encourage anyone who's interested in kind of the global perspective on climate change to tune into some of that when it happens again.
Jean, if I could just add to that very quickly, if we're talking about global impacts, I would urge everyone not to ignore climate migration, which we're already seeing. We've been seeing it from Africa going into Europe. We're already seeing it at our southern border, because not everyone is fleeing political conflict or duress in their countries. They're also fleeing a crashed economy that's crashed because of extreme heat, drought, et cetera, that's really killed their local economies.
That's a very good point. We're going to run over a little bit because there's still some good questions to pose. Scott Donaldson asked, do you recommend homeowners have an energy audit done before embarking on improvements to try to reduce energy use? If so, why? Who wants to tackle that one first?
Eleanor, you, me?
Or Mary Ann?
I can tell you that one of the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act is to help support energy audits. You should be able to do that and call your utility up and get that energy audit done at very little cost. And since it's very little cost, I think that it's a great way to start. You'll find out things you didn't even know about, where you need insulation and where you can begin to make those kinds of changes. But don't ignore also some of those resources that Eleanor and Demetra and Evan put forward on other things that you can do in your homes.
Christine Conrad asks, how can Arlington and Alexandria incentivize rooftop gardens / agriculture as a tool for stormwater management?
When you talk about incentivize, I just want to point out our green building incentive program. Very quickly, Virginia does not allow local jurisdictions to adopt its own building codes. So we have to go to the state code, which admittedly is around 3 to 6 years behind the international standard. So we have an incentive program that was launched in 2020, and it has evolved and upgrades. And 3 years ago, we added on a level of biophilic measures that were extraordinary. So it's already built into there. We're having an update that will come forward to the board in early 2024, and that is actually going to increase the incentive for biophilic measures, which includes green roofs.
Anyone else want to respond to that? Okay.
I would just say go into the advocacy piece based off Demetra's comments. It sounds like that's something someone could take to their delegate and senators who serve in the General Assembly.
I'm going to just make the second to the last question. David Smith asks, has Arlington assessed the impacts to our waterways due to superheated water coming off of parking lots and roads?
There hasn't been an exact study. We are looking at surface water heat, because heat actually in water, and particularly when you're talking about more shallow bodies of water, tends to leach oxygen out of it. And Eleanor's group has been really working very closely for years now with our stormwater program and the water quality program, because the biological diversity and vitality of our waterways can go down in extreme heat. And we're just noticing all over, even the oceans have experienced a really significant increase in the surface temperature. And you're talking about whole oceans. So it is an issue.
And I'm going to make this the last question, but unfortunately, I think Dimitri, you're probably going to be the one primarily answering it, but it does touch upon a lot of, David Schul asks that, he says that the county is taking on a lot of different efforts around climate change, flood water infrastructure, tree planting, trying to avoid heat islands as being one. Another, renewable power sources, changing power sources is another. Another one would be the tax on plastic bags and how we do some of these smaller things to improve. How is Arlington analyzing the level of spending and effort that should be put into these different types of actions?
First of all, I'm glad that you went through such a diversity of actions, because I do want to emphasize that, we work really well and closely over a long period of time with Eleanor's, organization, Eco Action, but we also work across the entire government column with all of our other bureaus and departments, because it is transportation, government buildings, waste, solid waste, everything. So what I would, though, encourage, because these actions are collected again in the community energy plan roadmap, the operationalization. And what we did, in addition to making cross sector, there's 6 sectors covered in there of actions, is that each action has a profile page, and included among the great detail in those profile pages is we did an analysis of the orders of magnitude of investment, the return on investment, and the impact on the greenhouse gas reduction.
Well, I think that's it for the evening. And I will tell you, we're getting some very positive feedback from our audience about the value of this presentation by all of you. So I want to thank you all very much for participating in this program tonight. And on that note, we're going to basically close for the evening. I want to have you all mark your calendars for November 8th and January 10th. And those are beyond next program. We will not be around for December. If you want to watch the recording of tonight's program, like our Facebook page and view Facebook Live, and consider sharing the Facebook Live with your friends if this is a topic that is important to them. Tonight's program has been recorded and will be posted on our website. Thank you for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you again next month, and don't forget to donate, and happy holidays.
Jean, thank you for the invitation. I look forward, Marianne and Evan. I always work with Eleanor, but I look forward to hopefully working more closely with you in the future.
Thank you. You too.
Sounds great. Thank you all.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.